Housing crisis looming. How California is losing its real estate value. For the first time in modern history, more people are leaving California than moving in. In 2023, California experienced a net population loss of over 340,000 residents, marking the third consecutive year of decline. This isn't just a demographic shift. This represents the collapse of what was once considered the American dream's epicenter. The Golden State, which built its reputation on opportunity and innovation, is now witnessing an unprecedented exodus that threatens to reshape the entire U.S. housing market. The numbers tell a story that traditional economists never predicted. The median home price in California reached $830,000 in 2024, more than double the national average of $400,000. This means that even households earning $150,000 annually, which places them in the top 20% of American earners, cannot afford to purchase a median-priced home in most California markets. The situation becomes even more stark when you consider that the recommended housing cost should not exceed 30% of gross income. For most Californians, housing now consumes 50% to 60% of their total household budget. Major corporations are responding to this crisis by relocating their operations. Tesla moved its headquarters to Texas, Oracle shifted to Austin, and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise relocated to Houston. These aren't just symbolic moves, they represent billions in economic value and thousands of high-paying jobs leaving the state. When companies that helped build Silicon Valley's reputation decide the costs outweigh the benefits, it signals a fundamental breakdown in California's economic model. The rental market presents an equally concerning picture. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco exceeds $3,400 per month, while in Los Angeles it surpasses $2,800. These figures force working professionals to live in conditions that previous generations would have considered temporary, with many adults sharing apartments well into their 30s and 40s, not by choice but by economic necessity. The concept of homeownership has become so distant for young Californians that many have simply removed it from their life planning entirely. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is California's outsized influence on the national economy. As the world's fifth largest economy, California's gross state product exceeds $3.5 trillion, representing approximately 15% of the entire U.S. GDP. When an economic entity of this magnitude experiences structural instability, the ripple effects extend far beyond state borders. California's housing crisis is already driving migration patterns that are overwhelming housing markets in Texas, Arizona, Idaho, and Colorado. The demographic data reveals the depth of this transformation. Young professionals, families with children, and middle-class households represent the largest segments of the outbound migration. These are the people who traditionally form the backbone of healthy communities and stable housing markets. They're being replaced by either wealthy individuals who can afford current prices or lower-income residents who qualify for assistance programs, creating a hollowed-out middle class that historically drove economic growth. This population shift challenges fundamental assumptions about American housing markets. California has always been viewed as a trendsetter, with housing policies and market conditions eventually spreading to other states. If California's current trajectory represents the future of American housing, then millions of Americans may need to fundamentally reconsider their expectations about homeownership, family formation, and economic mobility. Understanding how California reached this point and where it's heading next isn't just important for Californians, it's essential for anyone who wants to understand the future of American housing markets. Problem establishment. California's housing crisis didn't emerge overnight, but the acceleration of price growth over the past decade has created conditions that economists describe as unprecedented in American housing history. Between 2012 and 2022, California home prices increased by an average of 8.5% annually, far outpacing both inflation and wage growth. This compound effect means that a home purchased for $500,000 in 2012 now sells for over $1.1 million, representing a 120% increase in just one decade. The supply and demand imbalance underlying this crisis is staggering in its scope. California needs to build approximately 180,000 new housing units annually to meet current demand, yet the state has consistently produced only 80,000 to 100,000 units per year. This chronic underproduction has accumulated into a deficit of more than 1.2 million housing units statewide. To put this shortage in perspective, California would need to build homes at twice its current rate for the next 15 years just to close the existing gap, assuming no population growth. Geographic constraints compound the supply problem, but they don't fully explain it. While California faces natural limitations from mountains, deserts, and coastlines, the state has vast areas suitable for development that remain off-limits due to regulatory restrictions. Los Angeles County alone contains enough undeveloped or underdeveloped land to house millions of additional residents. Yet zoning laws restrict most of this land to single-family homes at low densities. This regulatory framework, designed in the 1960s for a state with half its current population, has become a structural barrier to addressing modern housing needs. The income required to purchase a median-priced California home has risen to approximately $200,000 annually, assuming a 20% down payment and current interest rates. This threshold excludes roughly 85% of California households from homeownership. Even more troubling, this figure represents household income, meaning it often requires two high-earning professionals to achieve homeownership. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, and other essential workers find themselves permanently locked out of homeownership in the communities they serve. Rental markets offer little relief from these pressures. California's average rent-to-income ratio has reached 32%, compared to the national average of 25%. This means the typical California renter spends nearly one-third of their gross income on housing alone, before considering utilities, insurance, and other housing-related costs. The practical effect is that California renters have significantly less disposable income for savings, healthcare, education, and other investments that traditionally build long-term financial stability. The human cost of these economic pressures extends beyond housing itself. California leads the nation in unsheltered homelessness, with over 170,000 individuals experiencing homelessness on any given night. While homelessness results from multiple factors, housing costs represent the primary driver of this crisis. Research demonstrates a direct correlation between regional housing costs and homelessness rates, with every $100 increase in median rent associated with a 9% increase in homelessness within that region. These conditions create a self-reinforcing cycle of economic dysfunction. High housing costs drive out middle-income residents, reducing the tax base needed to fund public services and infrastructure. Simultaneously, the remaining population becomes increasingly polarized between wealthy homeowners who benefit from rising property values and lower-income renters who struggle with housing costs. This dynamic eliminates the economic diversity that historically made California communities resilient and dynamic, replacing it with an unsustainable model that benefits existing property owners while excluding new residents and workers. The three root causes. Understanding California's housing crisis requires examining three interconnected systemic failures that have created the current catastrophe. These aren't recent problems but decades-old policy decisions that have compounded into an unsustainable situation affecting millions of residents and threatening the state's economic future. The first and most significant cause stems from California's Byzantine regulatory framework that makes housing construction extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The average timeline from initial planning to completed construction for a residential project in California ranges from 4 to 7 years, compared to 18 to 24 months in Texas or Florida. This extended timeline isn't accidental, but results from multiple layers of review, approval, and potential legal challenges built into the state's development process. Environmental impact reports alone can take 2 to 3 years and cost developers millions of dollars before construction begins. California's zoning laws, largely unchanged since the 1960s, prohibit multifamily housing across 75% of residential land in major cities. This means that in cities facing severe housing shortages, vast areas remain restricted to single-family homes on large lots, preventing the natural densification that would increase housing supply. Los Angeles, despite being one of America's densest metropolitan areas, has zoning that permits only single-family homes across more than 70% of its residential land. San Francisco, facing the nation's most expensive housing market, restricts building heights across most of the city to levels that were appropriate when the population was half its current size. The second major factor involves California's approach to land use, which artificially constrains developable land through policies that prioritize preservation over housing production. The California Environmental Quality Act, originally designed to prevent pollution, now functions as a tool to block housing development through litigation. Neighborhood groups routinely use environmental lawsuits to halt projects that meet all zoning and building requirements, creating additional uncertainty and cost for developers. These lawsuits don't typically address genuine environmental concerns, but instead use environmental law as a mechanism to prevent change in established neighborhoods. Historical preservation designations have expanded far beyond their original intent, now covering entire neighborhoods and preventing redevelopment of underutilized properties. In cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, properties built as recently as the 1960s receive historical protection, making it illegal to demolish or significantly modify buildings that could otherwise be replaced with higher density housing. This preservation approach treats all change as inherently negative, ignoring the housing needs of current and future residents. The third systemic cause involves California's tax structure, which creates perverse incentives that discourage housing production and encourage speculation. Proposition 13, passed in 1978, caps property tax increases at 2% annually regardless of actual property value increases. While intended to protect longtime homeowners from rising taxes, This policy has created massive inequities, where similar properties pay vastly different tax amounts based solely on when they were purchased. More problematically, Proposition 13 reduces the incentive for property owners to develop their land to its highest and best use, since they pay minimal taxes regardless of how productively they use their property. These three factors interact to create a housing market that functions more like a cartel than a competitive economy. Existing property owners benefit from artificial scarcity that drives up their property values, while regulatory barriers prevent new competitors from entering the market. The result is a system that maximizes returns for existing property owners while imposing enormous costs on everyone else, including businesses, workers, and the broader economy that depends on California's continued growth and dynamism. The domino effect. California's housing crisis has transcended state boundaries, creating ripple effects that are reshaping housing markets across the United States and fundamentally altering American migration patterns. The outbound flow of California residents represents the largest interstate migration in modern American history, with profound implications for both origin and destination markets. Texas has emerged as the primary beneficiary and victim of California's dysfunction, receiving over 100,000 former California residents annually. Austin's housing prices have increased by 45% since 2020, largely driven by California transplants who arrive with substantial equity from selling their California homes. These migrants can outbid local Texas buyers, creating affordability crises in previously accessible markets. Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio are experiencing similar pressures, with California migrants comprising 15% to 20% of home purchases in these metropolitan areas. Idaho represents perhaps the most dramatic example of California spillover effects. Boise's median home price increased from $350,000 in 2019 to over $550,000 in 2023, primarily due to California migrants who view Idaho prices as bargains compared to their origin markets. This influx has priced out longtime Idaho residents, creating political tensions and inspiring policy discussions about residency requirements for home purchases. The irony is palpable as California policies that restrict housing supply are now creating housing affordability problems in states that previously avoided such issues. Arizona's Phoenix metropolitan area illustrates how California's crisis cascades through regional economies. California transplants now represent the largest source of Phoenix homebuyers, driving up prices in neighborhoods that were historically accessible to middle-class families. The economic disruption extends beyond housing into labor markets, as California companies follow their relocated employees, creating job competition and wage pressures that benefit some workers while displacing others. Colorado's Denver market has experienced similar California-driven price inflation, but with additional complications from the state's own regulatory restrictions that mirror California's failed policies. The combination of California migration pressure and California-style zoning restrictions is creating a second-generation housing crisis that threatens to replicate California's problems in previously affordable markets. The financial mechanics of this migration amplify its economic impact. California homeowners who sell properties purchased before the recent price surge often realize gains of $300,000 to $600,000 or more. This equity allows them to purchase homes in destination markets with cash or substantial down payments, giving them significant competitive advantages over local buyers who rely on traditional financing. The result is a wealth transfer from California property owners to themselves while imposing housing costs on residents of destination states. National mortgage markets are adapting to these migration patterns in ways that further amplify their effects. Lenders now offer specialized programs for California equity migrants, recognizing this demographic as a low-risk, high-profit customer segment. These programs often provide preferential rates and terms, further enhancing California migrants' competitive advantages in their new markets. The economic implications extend beyond housing into broader regional development patterns. States receiving California migrants must expand infrastructure, schools, and public services to accommodate population growth, but often lack the tax base to fund this expansion since many California migrants work remotely and pay taxes to California. This creates fiscal pressures on destination communities while providing minimal tax benefits to offset the costs of growth. The political consequences are equally significant, as California's housing policies now influence political debates in states across the country. Local politicians in Texas, Idaho, and Arizona find themselves responding to housing affordability concerns that didn't exist before California's housing crisis began driving interstate migration, fundamentally altering political priorities and policy discussions in states that previously avoided such issues. Future scenarios. California's housing crisis will resolve through one of three potential scenarios, each with distinct implications for residents, investors, and the broader American economy. Understanding these scenarios is crucial for making informed decisions about housing, career planning, and investment strategies in an environment of unprecedented economic uncertainty. The first scenario involves gradual market correction through incremental policy reforms and natural market adjustments. This scenario assumes California policymakers implement modest zoning reforms, streamline development approval processes, and reduce regulatory barriers over a 5 to 7 year timeline. Housing production would increase gradually from current levels of 100,000 units annually to 150,000 units by 2030. This increased supply would moderate price growth without causing dramatic value declines, with home prices stabilizing rather than continuing their unsustainable trajectory. Rent growth would slow to match inflation rates, providing relief for current residents while maintaining property values for existing owners. Under this scenario, California would retain most of its economic base while becoming somewhat more affordable over time. The state would continue experiencing modest population loss as prices remain elevated, but the rate of outmigration would decrease as conditions stabilize. Major employers would maintain their California operations while expanding in other states, creating a balanced approach that preserves California's advantages while reducing its cost pressures. This outcome requires significant political will and sustained policy focus, making it possible but challenging to achieve. The second scenario involves substantial market correction triggered by accelerated outmigration and economic disruption. This scenario assumes California fails to implement meaningful housing reforms while economic pressures continue mounting. Home prices would decline 25% to 35% over a 3 to 4 year period as demand softens due to continued population loss and reduced economic activity. This correction would create opportunities for new buyers while imposing significant losses on recent purchasers and highly leveraged property owners. Under this scenario, California would experience a regional recession as declining property values reduce consumer spending and state tax revenues. However, the correction would ultimately restore affordability and attract new residents and businesses drawn by lower costs and reduced competition for housing. This scenario parallels California's experience during the early 1990s recession, when significant job losses and population decline eventually created conditions for renewed growth. The correction would be painful but ultimately sustainable, requiring 3 to 5 years for full recovery. The third scenario involves systemic economic crisis extending beyond California's borders and triggering national housing market disruption. This scenario assumes California's problems cascade through interconnected financial and economic systems, creating broader instability. Housing price declines would exceed 40% as credit markets tighten and economic confidence collapses. The crisis would spread to other states through bank failures, reduced investment, and declining consumer confidence. This scenario would represent the most severe housing crisis since the Great Depression, requiring federal intervention to stabilize markets and prevent complete economic collapse. California's role as a major economic engine means its failure would have national implications, potentially triggering recession across multiple states and requiring coordinated policy responses from federal authorities. Recovery would require 5 to 10 years, and fundamental restructuring of housing finance and land use policies. The probability assessment for these scenarios depends largely on policy responses over the next 24 to 36 months. Current trends suggest the second scenario as most likely, with gradual correction possible if reform efforts accelerate and systemic crisis possible if current policies continue without modification. The key variables are political will for reform, economic resilience of major California industries, and the broader national economic environment's stability during this transition period. Lessons and opportunities. California's housing crisis provides critical lessons for anyone navigating today's complex real estate landscape. Understanding these patterns can help investors, individuals, and communities make better decisions about housing and economic development. For real estate investors, California demonstrates how regulatory risk can override traditional investment fundamentals. While investors typically focus on location and economic growth, California shows that zoning restrictions and approval processes can create or destroy investment value regardless of market demand. Smart investors now examine local development policies as carefully as they study demographics. Markets that embrace housing production offer better long-term prospects than those that restrict supply, even when current economic indicators favor restrictive markets. The California exodus creates specific investment opportunities in destination states. Texas, Arizona, and Idaho markets benefit from California equity migration, where former California homeowners arrive with substantial cash from property sales. Investors who identify neighborhoods likely to attract these migrants can capitalize on this wealth transfer. However, this migration eventually creates affordability problems in destination markets, requiring careful timing and exit strategies. For individuals considering relocation, California's crisis offers a framework for evaluating potential destinations. Successful markets combine employment opportunities with reasonable housing costs and development-friendly policies. Cities like Nashville, Raleigh, and Austin have attracted economic growth while maintaining relative affordability through smart policy decisions. Individuals should prioritize markets where local governments actively support housing production rather than restricting it. California's experience also highlights the importance of timing in housing decisions. When supply cannot respond to demand, waiting for better conditions often proves costly. Young professionals in growing markets should consider homeownership earlier rather than assuming prices will moderate. The opportunity cost of delaying purchase in supply-constrained markets typically exceeds the benefits of waiting for perfect timing. Policymakers can learn from California's regulatory failures. States maintaining housing affordability share common characteristics: streamlined approval processes, zoning that permits appropriate density, and leadership that prioritizes housing production over neighborhood preservation. These states prove that economic growth and housing affordability can coexist when policies support rather than restrict development. The crisis demonstrates the need for regional policy coordination. Housing markets cross municipal boundaries, but policies are set locally by officials who may not consider regional impacts. Successful states have implemented policies that override local restrictions when they conflict with broader housing needs. California's fundamental lesson is that housing markets fail when policies prevent supply from responding to demand. Markets embracing change create opportunities for residents and investors, while those resisting change create problems for everyone except existing property owners benefiting from artificial scarcity. California's housing crisis extends far beyond state boundaries, representing a fundamental test of whether American communities can adapt to economic growth and demographic change. This crisis offers lessons that every person interested in real estate, economics, or public policy should understand and apply. The scope of California's national influence makes this everyone's concern. California generates 15% of U.S. GDP and contains 12% of the population, making it impossible to isolate California's problems from national economic trends. When housing costs force businesses to relocate and workers to migrate, these decisions create competitive pressures and opportunities across the entire American economy. Educational institutions should prioritize housing policy research using California as a primary case study. The state's experience provides real-world data about regulatory effects on housing markets, offering valuable insights for communities facing similar challenges. Universities should develop programs focused on evidence-based housing policy analysis rather than theoretical planning discussions. Citizens can contribute to better housing outcomes by engaging with local politics and demanding data-driven policy decisions. California's crisis resulted partly from decades of decisions by officials who prioritized short-term political considerations over long-term community needs. Residents who understand housing economics can advocate for supply-supporting policies while opposing measures that create artificial scarcity. The private sector has opportunities to develop solutions addressing housing challenges revealed by California's experience. Technology companies can create tools that streamline development approvals and reduce construction costs. Financial institutions can design products supporting housing production rather than speculation, recognizing that healthy real estate markets require ongoing supply creation. Professional opportunities should emerge around housing policy expertise as communities nationwide recognize the need for specialists understanding regulatory and economic interactions. Urban planning programs should incorporate comprehensive housing policy analysis, preparing planners to make evidence-based rather than ideologically driven decisions. International implications deserve attention, as housing affordability problems affect major cities worldwide. London, Toronto, and Sydney face similar supply restriction and regulatory complexity challenges. California's experience offers lessons for international policymakers about consequences of prioritizing preservation over adaptation to economic change. The fundamental question California's crisis raises is whether democratic institutions can make difficult decisions required for community sustainability. Housing policy involves complex trade-offs between competing interests, but avoiding these decisions creates worse outcomes for everyone. Communities learning from California's experience and proactively addressing housing challenges will create better resident opportunities and stronger economic foundations. California's housing crisis serves as both warning and opportunity. Understanding its causes and consequences provides the knowledge necessary to build more functional, equitable, and sustainable housing markets across America and beyond.